Today's video is all about Vancouver winter, and as you can see, it's definitely winter right now. It's very cold, I gotta tell you. But is this typical of a Vancouver winter? That's what we're gonna get into in this video. What is a typical Vancouver winter like? What can you expect when you're living here? Are there areas that are more suited to some types of weather than others? All of those are details that we're gonna get into in this video. Stay tuned, we're getting into it right now. There's a few days in every Vancouver winter that make everything absolutely worthwhile, and today is one of those days. I didn't want to make this video until we had one of these days in the winter of 2023, 2024. Today's that day. It is beautiful. The sun is shining. You can see behind me, the mountains are covered with snow. Air is very crisp. It's very cold, unusually cold in fact. This is not typical sort of winter weather for Vancouver. It's an unusual cold snap that we're having. It's about minus 15 at the moment. Apparently it feels like minus 25. Gotta say, standing here right now in front of the bay behind me, it feels more like minus 30 or something. It's incredibly cold for Vancouver. My hands are shaking, my ears are frozen. I can barely feel my feet. And yet, you know, it is one of these spectacular Vancouver winter days where it's one of those days where people kind of forget how bad everything leading up to it was. Weeks of rain and wet and cold and darkness. Then suddenly the sun comes out and it's shining and it's bright and everybody is smiling. So for a couple weeks you might not see the sun, and then all of a sudden the sun breaks out and everybody's happy, everybody's much more positive, and people are out and about enjoying one another's company, interacting with strangers. Today is just one of those beautiful Vancouver summer days. Today is just one of those beautiful Vancouver winter days. It's been about 10 degrees most of the winter, and now it's mid-January and this is our first cold snap. It's very cold for Vancouver. It's minus 15, minus 16 right now. My mouth is frozen. I can't talk properly. Apparently it feels like minus 25 is what they are saying. But this cold snap just came in yesterday and it started snowing right around rush hour, right around the time I had to go out and pick up my kids. It was kind of traffic chaos yesterday evening. There were massive amounts of accidents all throughout the Lower Mainland, and that's pretty typical and something that we get made up a lot of fun of when we get snowfalls. But it's very typical for the first snowfall, I think pretty much in any Canadian city, not just in Vancouver. It was just about 5 centimeters of snow, but it was coming down very thickly around 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. A lot of people left work early in order to miss the big snowfall that they thought was coming, and it tailed off pretty quickly. You can see on the ground behind me, there's not a ton of snow. And so we get this happening. In fact, you know, to be honest, I can only remember one other time in my life that it got this cold in Vancouver, and that was when I was in high school, I think. I remember riding my bike to school that day, and this kind of feeling in my mouth that I couldn't enunciate words very well. But nevertheless, I'm out here wanting to show you what winters are like in Vancouver. This is what winter can be like. But it's certainly not what is typical of a Vancouver winter. A lot of people are out and enjoying the sun right now because again, the sun isn't necessarily something that we end up seeing tons of in the winter months in Vancouver. But when we get it, we all want to come out and enjoy it and make the most of it, whether or not it's cold. And it is cold today. If you're playing word association with Vancouver and winter, probably there's other words that come to mind, such as rain, cold, dark, lack of sunshine. Those are all part of the stereotype of a Vancouver winter. Because they're a stereotype, they're based on some degree of truth. I can't say that they're entirely wrong, but there are some nuances when it comes to what the actual truth is here. Let's talk about rain specifically to begin with. Most of the precipitation that happens in a Vancouver winter is rain and not snow. Vancouver gets more rain than most other cities in Canada. That's absolutely true. However, the rain tends to be very consistent and it tends to be relatively light. We don't really get what would, you know, if you've ever been to the tropics, like a huge tropical downpour, really, really heavy rain. We get a very consistent rain that happens over the course of winter months. Just about every day is going to have some form of precipitation to some degree. There are certainly days where it's heavier than others, but for the most part, it's a lighter rain, to the point actually that a real Vancouverite doesn't even own an umbrella. They own a coat like I'm wearing, a jacket like I'm wearing right now. A good rain jacket is incredibly important, but an umbrella, most Vancouverites are going to find, isn't really all that necessary because it protects you from that really heavy rain. But when it's just light rain and you're just running from one building to another, an umbrella is kind of an annoyance. You have to remember where it is. I don't know how many umbrellas I've lost over the course of my lifetime when people have handed them to me, usually my mother, and then it gets left somewhere, and I just don't bother with umbrellas anymore. And then there's the dark. Along with a lot of the rain, obviously, comes the clouds. Vancouver tends in the winter months to have a cloud cover, and you can see, can we see them just barely, maybe in the distance behind me, up there, the mountains. The clouds come off the Pacific Ocean and they get socked up against the mountains there. The result is they then drop rain on the city through the winter, but that cloud cover keeps us from getting direct sunlight for many days through the winter. We get a similar amount of sunshine to Toronto, but a lot less than you're going to find in prairie provinces. And we get a lot of people migrating to Vancouver from places like Regina and Saskatoon or Winnipeg or Calgary or Edmonton over the course of time. And many of those people are used to very bright, sunny winters. That's definitely not what you're going to experience in Vancouver, despite what's happening today. This is not what is typical. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, if you're from other parts of the world, and especially places that are further south, that we get, being in the northern hemisphere in the winter months, a lot less sun. In fact, today's January 12th, sunrise was 8 a.m. and sunset is 4:30 p.m. So a lot of people are going to find that they're getting to work, the sun's barely up, and then they leave work and the sun is down in the middle of winter. So yes, winters in Vancouver can be darker than they are in other parts of the world and in some other places of North America as well. And then let's talk about snow. So as you can see around me, it does snow in Vancouver, despite what we said about most precipitation being rain and not snow. I'd say a typical Vancouver winter sees about 4 to 5 snowfalls a year. Those snowfalls might be about 10 centimeters of snow at a time, roughly on average. The one last night was about 5 centimeters, so a little bit below average. But then we can get huge snow dumps. There's usually one every year, maybe two. Those snowfalls can be somewhere above 30 centimeters, maybe 30 to 50 centimeters. So we can get some very significant snowfall still, despite Vancouver not being a place that's really known for its snow. And you will have snow, but it does depend on what part of the Lower Mainland you're living in. And then finally, let's talk about temperatures. Well, for the most part, our winters hover around 0 degrees. This winter has been rather unusual that it's rarely fallen below, I think, about 8 degrees. Even 10 degrees has been, kind of the norm for the last couple months. That's highly unusual, but we do get down to around 0 pretty regularly in a winter. Now, it will fluctuate down to maybe about -5 when it gets a bit of a cold chill, cold snap. Even -10 can happen probably a couple times a year. What's happening right now is very unusual, as I've mentioned a couple times, where it's -16 was the low last night. Right now, I think it's about -14 or so. It's warmed up a slight amount. And the wind chill brings, apparently it feels like -25. So this is definitely cold. That's unusual in Vancouver. Now, everybody's got a preference. When it comes to weather, it's like everything else. I gotta say, my preference is definitely a mild, moderate, temperate climate like we have here in Vancouver, where we don't tend to have real extremes in the summer months or the winter month. Around 0 is okay to me. It's not too crazy cold, especially for Canada. I mean, if you're coming from, somewhere south of the border, you may find Canadian temperatures extremely cold. But for Canada, Vancouver's a really mild, pleasant spot. This kind of temperature right now I'm struggling with. I find it hard to survive when it's well below 0. And so I'd prefer to be in a place that doesn't see too much of that. And I give up maybe a little bit of sunlight and I get a little more rain as a result in the winter months. But I'm okay with that trade-off personally. 3 of my kids had their first experience of real bitter Canadian cold today. And when they woke up, they were really excited. They looked out the window and they saw the snow and they were gearing up to get outside and just couldn't wait to be out there. We had them all at the front door this morning. I went outside. I was going outside first to basically clear the ice off the car and make sure everything was ready and warm up the car. I opened the front door, and within about 10 seconds, all three of them started crying, freaking out because of how cold it was. They just had no understanding of how cold it could get. And so my children, at least three of them, their preference is definitely a Vancouver winter and not a Regina winter. They're more than willing, more than happy to have a little bit more rain, a little more darkness, but a lot less cold and a lot less snow. More than happy with that trade-off. I can tell you that 100%. And I would say most Vancouverites are also more than happy to make that trade-off. You don't stay in Vancouver if that really bothers you. Most Vancouverites are just willing to make that trade-off. Plus, I have to point out that Vancouver is also one of those places that has a really easy access to winter activities. You can see the North Shore Mountains right up there. And that's where we can get up to if there's not enough snow on the ground down here and you want to be up in the snow. You just spend about half an hour driving up into those mountains and you're on some fantastic ski slopes. Whether you want to go downhill skiing, snowboarding, cross-country skiing, or snowshoeing, all of that activity can happen up in those mountains. Now, again, as I've said a few times, this winter has been unusual in that we haven't been all that cold. The result of not being all that cold is there hasn't been too much snow up there on those mountains. That is unusual. We do typically have a decent amount of snow. And even if these mountains don't get too much snow, there's also Whistler, which is about an hour and a half to 2 hours away. So some epic winter wonderland activities available not too far away. I think one of the most important things to remember when it comes to Vancouver winters is that the entire Vancouver area is not uniform. All the different suburbs and neighborhoods of Vancouver have different kinds of winters. And we can think of Vancouver very much as a homogeneous area, but it definitely isn't. There's enormous variations from one side of Vancouver to another. And that's incredibly important to remember, especially if you're moving here from somewhere else. So before I get into that, I want to remind you that I am a real estate agent. If you want help finding the right areas to move to, whether it's due to winter or where you're working or where you want your kids to go to school, be sure to reach out. Let's have a conversation about what it's like moving you and your family here to Vancouver. But when it comes to rain, there are some areas of Vancouver that have more than 3 times the amount of rain of other areas. And some of those areas we can see way in the distance there, right up against the mountains. So as I explained earlier, with the clouds coming in off the Pacific, getting stuck up against the mountains, they're dropping their load of precipitation on that side most of all, more than any other place. So you're going to find North Vancouver, Port Moody, Coquitlam being areas that see a lot more precipitation, and then even further east as well, areas like Maple Ridge or Mission. Those areas see much more precipitation than even the city of Vancouver does. But there's areas that see a lot less precipitation, and those areas tend to be further south, further away from the mountains. And those areas would be areas like Delta, Richmond, and Tawasin. There's also areas that see much more snow. Not all those areas are right up there against the mountains, but those are areas that see probably about twice as much snow as some other areas. So North Vancouver again, Port Moody, Coquitlam, but there are some areas that see more snow than what we see here in Vancouver, because Vancouver is moderated by the ocean. So we're right up against the ocean. We're a bit warmer. We don't get as much snow as some areas further east. Areas like Surrey, Langley, and definitely Chilliwack get a lot more snow than we tend to here in Vancouver. And then lastly, in terms of sunlight, there's also areas that see more and less sunlight. Again, some of the areas that see less sunlight would be North Vancouver, an area like Deep Cove in North Vancouver in particular, the village of Anmore, that would be another spot that sees a lot less sunlight than other areas. But the areas that are known to get much more sunlight than most would be Tawasin, South Surrey, and White Rock. So you sort of need to be wise about where you're moving based on your preferences, and be aware that there are stereotypes that aren't necessarily true throughout all of Metro Vancouver. So there's everything about Vancouver winters. I hope you got value out of this video, and if you did, hit that like button and smash subscribe if you want to see more videos about living in and moving to Vancouver, as I do put out videos like that every single week. And if you're thinking about moving to Vancouver, be sure to reach out, as I am a real estate agent in Vancouver. My contact information is right here on the screen. Reach out anytime and we can begin that conversation about moving you and your family to Vancouver and making that transition. If you're interested in more videos just like this one, as I said, I do put these videos out every week, but a couple I think you're really gonna like. This one over here is all about weather in Vancouver, not just winter, but all year round. And then this video over here is one that I just did, all about what it's like living in Vancouver and whether or not it's safe. I think you're gonna really enjoy those two videos. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end, and I hope to see you on next week's video as well.